Alright, so let's go ahead and end the Robert Rodriguez Mexico Trilogy with his final one, which was Once Upon a Time in Mexico, that came out in 2003, but was initially shot in 2001 before... it's interesting how this basically ended up being the Johnny Depp show of all things, and it came out like right after Pirates in 2003, where I think Pirates came out that summer, and then this was in September. So it's almost like Rodriguez kind of foresaw the whole Depp shooting into the stratosphere thing in 2003, and it just kind of happened that way. And of course, the title might give you the vibe of the Leone westerns, but minus Once Upon a Time in the West, obviously the idea appears to stem from Leone's Dollars trilogy. And it's my understanding that, based on the Dollars trilogy, Rodriguez had always planned on making it a trilogy, and it was Tarantino's idea to give it its title, which of course we saw with his latest movie, and then the first chapter of Inglourious Basterds, that Tarantino's all about this Once Upon a Time title, and it obviously seems to be working out well for nearly everyone that uses it. So, and as far as it starting off, we do have a very similar opening to that of Desperado, where we talked about the legend factor of El Mariachi himself and how these things have happened. And what's really funny is, I was talking about the opening scene of Desperado and how when Buscemi was telling the story, it's clear that there were like embellishments that give it more of this legend vibe. And then as Cheech's character is talking to Depp, he even says in actual dialogue, there may be embellishments to this story, and as we see, it's even more over the top than it was when it was being told at the beginning of Desperado. And we've got great little details here now, like the rolling bar is a detail I always like, and how he actually like cocks the guitar case, even though we saw towards the end of Desperado that the guitar cases are their own endless arsenal in themselves now, with just having to carry one thing. But while this one doesn't seem to get as over the top as that scene was, there's still very much a sort of legend-like air around this movie in general, which is really great. But what's interesting about El Mariachi being our main focus is, number one, especially coming off Desperado, the idea that we set up the whole love story between him and Carolina, and then how that ended. And then in this one, she's just died in between movies, and which makes sense because then it becomes another revenge story very similar to Desperado, which we saw the start of that at the end of El Mariachi, and then it came in, and now we're kind of gotten that in between movies. There was like a whole other El Mariachi that happened in between these movies. So when he comes in, he's ready for vengeance all over again, despite the fact that Salma Hayek is plastered all over the advertising and is billed in the credits before Depp is. But had this been a little more after Pirates than it was, that may not have been the case, especially since, like I said, Depp basically ends up a large portion of this movie. Almost like there's a lot of the, especially with the plot coming in also, there's a lot where it feels like El Mariachi's almost kind of in the backseat, but we also know that that's because he's just kind of waiting to lunge. So we have that vibe throughout it. But to talk about Depp, and particularly this opening scene, what's really interesting about this character is it's clear how deadly he is, or how deadly he's going to be. But what I really love about this is how the whole opening sets up El Mariachi as the relentless killer. So when we get this opening, while we do get the sense that Depp's character Sands is deadly, we get this reveal after he's done talking to Cheech, and he gives him the Clash of the Titans lunchbox and sends him on his way, where there was a decoy arm here attached to him that he removes, and his actual arm had a gun under the table the whole time. And what's interesting about that reveal is the fact that the movie doesn't open with Depp killing anybody, but that reveal basically gives us the same impression of if he had. Like, whether or not he blew Cheech away in this scene, the end of the scene feels like it has the same effect regardless. And that's also proven when he actually does get to kill Cheech later. And then with that set up, building up this character, and then going into the scene he has with El Mariachi where he talks about how the food is too good, so he's going to go in the back and shoot the cook because it's a balance thing. And what's interesting about that is setting up this character in a way where I think that's the first time in the movie we see him kill somebody, if I'm not mistaken. I don't quite know this one as well as I do Desperado. I haven't seen it as many times over as I have Desperado, but the idea of that's just such an unpredictable act in itself, to shoot the cook for being too good, that when the scene actually ends with him going back there and doing it, it's interesting how it really sets up this character in an interesting way that he can tell us exactly what he's going to do, and yet when he actually does the thing he just told us he was going to do, it still somehow feels unpredictable and spontaneous. And that's the power that a character like this has. It's really interesting talking about how much Depp owns the part, because to my understanding, and not surprising whatsoever, it's one of those things you can get the vibe of while you're watching, and then when you learn later, it's like, well, yeah, of course. Apparently there's a lot of improvisation on Depp's part, and there was a lot of things that he added dialogue-wise to the character, and the shirts were his idea also, and how ridiculous they were. And I think I'm trying to figure out how much of that really embodies the character. When you look at the long list of people that were considered to play Sands before Depp got it, and apparently it was written for Clooney. And it's like, when you see the way Depp plays it, I can't imagine Clooney at all. But then it makes you wonder if Depp had so much control over this character, if it became a different character entirely than what it would have initially been. And if Clooney had played him, it would have been a totally different character. It would have been interesting to see Clooney revisit that coldness after their collaboration on From Dusk Till Dawn, but it's one of those cases now where I just can't imagine. I don't think this movie would have as good of a reputation as it does, or as memorable of a reputation as it does, without Depp's take on this character, because this character kind of walks away with this movie quite handily, despite it being another El Mariachi story, and it sort of coming back around to being his revenge story. The Sands character just kind of really took over this whole thing, and I don't think anybody's complaining. Typically it would be like, you want the El Mariachi story when you go into this trilogy, but the character is just so entertaining, and we still have enough of an El Mariachi focus that there's enough here to kind of please all those wants that you want to get out of this movie. And as far as Carolina being killed in between movies, that's something that never really bothered me that much, because when we were talking about Desperado, I was talking about how there wasn't a whole lot that her character had. Like, they had a nice team up there, and she got to take out a few people. But as far as that was handled, as far as her putting her into the story, there's just enough Hayek here that's worthwhile. That it doesn't really feel like too much was sacrificed, that she's not completely here throughout. So we get scenes like the chain scene, where they have this whole... They're escaping gunfire and they have to go down the building one at a time because they're chained together. Which is a really great scene, and to my understanding was a scene that was initially meant for Desperado and had to be cut out. So it ended up here. I think, to my understanding, a lot of this movie is stuff that was taken from other resources of Rodriguez, where it was like, I think there's another scene in here that was meant to be an El Mariachi that wasn't. And what's really interesting about this is we have a movie that clocks in at an hour 42, and there's so much improvisation and so much action in general that the script was only like 45 pages long, which is very interesting. And the whole thing of... apparently there was like a subplot that was added, but it ended up being one subplot too many, and with that subplot, it was about 60 pages, so it was basically added for padding, when the movie didn't really need padding to begin with anyway. So it makes sense that whatever that was... I don't know if I've ever heard what the subplot was exactly, but it's clearly not needed here, because it feels like a lot is going on already. There's a lot of new characters in this, and a lot of familiar faces playing them. With our antagonist, of course, being Berea, who is this drug kingpin played by Willem Dafoe, in this very sinister, threatening performance. Anytime the cartels are brought into a movie, you get kind of this nervous vibe that things are going to get really graphic really fast and really dangerous really fast. And this certainly adds that layer to it, especially with that character. And I love... It might seem over the top, but I mean, we're talking about a Rodriguez movie. I don't think you can go too over the top. The idea of him getting interrupted mid-cosmetic surgery and having to go the climax with the bandages on his face, and you can see like where he has no face underneath, and he literally looks like an actual monster and sounds like an actual monster when we see him by the end. And the fact that this character is played by Willem Dafoe just has... just everything about that is perfect. Like, everything about that just works. And that's one of those cases where I can't imagine it being another person. Even if the part is small, it's exactly the kind of part you'd want Willem Dafoe to have, especially in a movie by Rodriguez that's willing to take that extra mile and go that extra level of over the top, and with no shame whatsoever, nor should it be ashamed. And we were talking about Cheech earlier. I do also love the fact that Cheech comes back in this after being killed off in Desperado, and Danny Trejo comes back after being killed off in Desperado. And I think I heard something about how Cheech was initially supposed to be the same character, and Rodriguez remembered at the very last minute that his character died in Desperado, which is hilarious. But the reason I love this idea of them coming back as different characters is just this whole vibe of, like, it's because it's one thing to work with Rodriguez again and be one of his regulars, but when it's like a direct sequel to Desperado is when it's like, oh, that's interesting. But we've seen that in later movies like The Raid and stuff like that. But what I really love about it, especially being a Rodriguez movie and these being his regulars anyway, is it just has this really old-fashioned feel, like they're all in like this small club, this exclusive club, or like a troupe or something. And to see like the familiar faces playing different parts, there's something almost like intimate about that. That makes it really nice when you look at the whole trilogy as a whole, and how Rodriguez brings back his regulars and stuff like that, and the people that he works with the best. And apparently that was going to be the case regardless, because the Trejo part was written for Tarantino, another person that was killed in Desperado. And the only thing that stopped that was he was starting to work on Kill Bill Volume 1 around this time, which would have been fun. But I still like the fact that he brought back another person that had already been killed off. And worth noting that Trejo gets significantly more lines in this, so that pays off as well. There's also some interesting additions here, like the additions of musicians, like Enrique Iglesias being in here, where it's... when we had, obviously, his friends got killed off at the end of Desperado, so he's going to have a new couple of people with him, one of which is him. And then Ruben Blades has a really good role here, or Ruben Blades. It is, to my understanding, he will take either pronunciation of that. But the addition of his character, Ramirez, is very interesting as well, and I love the fact that it brings in this other layer of revenge story, where we've got revenge stories coming from all different angles in this, and everything colliding. It has a very, very classic feel to it, like the classic westerns and stuff like that, and something you'd see in the Leone western, specifically his Dollars trilogy. But in the stuff where we have him just kind of walking around, seemingly like typically he'd be like, you know, talking to backup or something, but being retired, it's like he's just sort of narrating his thoughts. And so all those scenes where he's just going around and following Mickey Rourke is really fun also. And, of course, the addition of Mickey Rourke as well, who I kind of wish had somewhat of a bigger part. Like, I feel like there's another universe where he's in the Dafoe part, but to have one be underneath the other and they're both here adds something, but, yeah, and then, of course, he's got his dog that he constantly walks around with, the dog with the name tag, Mocha, who was the villain in El Mariachi, which is an interesting callback. I don't know if it's, like, saying anything in particular, but it's a nice callback regardless. We've also got Eva Mendes in here with a nice twisty character, so the cast is, like, extremely expanded. We've got a lot going on. I can't imagine what that other subplot would have been that had added, like, 20 pages to the script. But like I said, it's clear there's enough here that we didn't really need it, and the characters by themselves and the actors in those parts enriching that enough. And of course, we're going to have a shitload of action, and it's got that same action that we saw and loved in Desperado, where it's like people get shot, and sometimes it's very bloody, and sometimes it's just like sparks shoot out of them and they fly across the room. and stuff like that. Like, there's even a charm to it, especially in Rodriguez movies when we know, even though now he's working with like a big budget, where it's like it significantly inflated after El Mariachi to Desperado, and now it's like gotten even bigger and a lot more to work with. But even then, knowing Rodriguez's roots and the way he comes from that whole school of like just using your environment and using whatever's there, and not doing reshoots and stuff like that, and just compromising to get whatever you need to do. Knowing that he comes from that, there's even a charm when some of the action may look a bit shit. Like, one moment only comes to mind, which is when El Mariachi is riding down the staircase on top of his guitar case, and it's clear there's some sort of like a digital meddling here or something, and it looks ridiculous. But I guess even that has some sort of charm to it, where it's like that whole idea of like the filmmakers that write beyond their means when they're doing something super low budget and haven't made a name for themselves yet. It sort of gives you the vibe like that. But now that Rodriguez was at the point that he was in his career here, there's almost a kind of charm about that, given that he came from that sort of style of filmmaking. So I really love that. And then we've talked about the whole cartel angle, bringing in a dark and graphic factor to this. So we have people having a bit more of a gruesome end than they might have in some of the other movies. As gruesome as the other movies have been up to this point, now we've got stuff like Sands losing his eyes, which is a really funny callback, because if I remember correctly, when he runs into the kid again that's selling gum, the kid ends up guiding him throughout the movie. And if I remember correctly, the last time he sees the kid before he loses his eyes he says, "I never want to see you again." It's like, technically he doesn't, despite being helped by him throughout the climax, which is just really funny. And the kind of ironic thing that would happen to Sands, of all people. It's like pretty much every decision Sands has made up to this point was leading to him suffering through the climax like this. And I love the way he never breaks character. How like he never breaks his personality, where it's like when after he has lost his eyes and he's walking around with just the sunglasses and you can see the blood dripping down his cheeks, he just seems sort of mildly inconvenienced by it in this really funny way that's very in line with the way the character behaves. Like when he sees the kid again and he just describes it as, "I'm having a bad day." Which is not just a very Sands thing to say, but something you totally expect from a Depp character. And like I said, this was before it kind of feels like the Depp character that we've come to know really took off and was a continuous thing. So he was like still finding it in here. He even says savvy the same way Jack Sparrow does at some point. And he gets his Mexicant line that you have heard so many times since then. I honestly have no idea if this movie coined that or not. I feel like it's something that I've heard forever, but it could just as very easily have been something I've only heard since 2003. I really don't know. But, yes, eventually, obviously, this is all going to come to a head in a hail of bullets, because of course it is. And I love this whole idea of the Sands character especially, because like I said, he really starts to take over the movie. But it's this whole thing where he gets basically a heroic moment at the end. Like when he gets to kill Eva Mendes, and then the point where there's like a couple of times where we think he's died, and then it's this big triumphant moment whenever he rises. It's like Rocky not being able to get taken down by Apollo. Every time he rises, it's like this big triumphant moment, and it's like, it's so interesting that with that character, there's a whole angle here where he's the villain, and there's the whole angle where he's a hero. And it's like we're kind of going down both paths at the same time with every other scene that he has. And that in itself is just really fun and interesting. Like I said, played in a way that I can only really see Depp doing, but especially the sort of bouncing back and forth between hero and villain, and we're not quite sure which one he's going to end up being by the end. Because like I was talking about with Clooney, who it was written for, I could just see like a coldness where I don't know if the hero factor would have worked as well. Even though it probably could have come through because he was Clooney. Maybe that's what Rodriguez was going for. But I don't know, there's something about the back and forth that Depp finds that I think really rings true in a way that would have been really hard to pull off. And talking about Rodriguez having this really big budget and this being a really big movie that made a whole lot of money, the fact that he was still finding ways to be innovative. Like, every project Rodriguez does is like trying to introduce something new into filmmaking. And to my understanding, this was around the time George Lucas was doing Attack of the Clones. But remembering this was shot in 2001, the year before that came out, after he had learned about the HD digital stuff, that's what he chose to shoot this movie on. So technically this movie was either the first or one of the first to be like a full movie in the HD digital format. Which is crazy. That's the kind of thing where it feels like it's kind of been around forever, and then when you go back to find where the origin was, it's always one of the least likely things, it feels like. Yeah, so he's just sort of constantly doing this. Like, and he was doing it as an experiment, which is the crazy thing, where it's like, let's just see, what these cameras can pick up, how they pick it up, and what sort of conditions they can withstand. It's like, and, the blistering heat when they were filming and stuff like that. And it obviously ended up working out for him. So, and it basically made him almost completely abandon film, interestingly enough. And the whole thing we were talking about, and he was talking about, when he made El Mariachi, $7,000 seems really, really, really cheap for a movie. But he even said, like, if it wasn't for film and the cost of film, it would have been significantly less. So it does make you wonder, like, how much El Mariachi would have been made for if he had these methods back then that he was clearly more than willing to embrace when they finally came around. And like I said, there's really just something so inspirational about the really hands-on way Rodriguez makes a movie, whether it be, obviously the writing and directing, and then the music and the editing, all that stuff. I love that he calls it chopping in the in the credits. I think it's shot, chopped, and composed and scored by, I think, all of that. So it's one of those cases where it's like we love film crews and they're obviously unsung heroes, but in Rodriguez's case, like, a lot of the crew is him by himself, and it's so all of that comes together in this really great way that really shows off what this trilogy accomplished. It's kind of the different way each one took on a new sort of filmmaking approach in general, in a sort of innovative way, is a whole other way to look at the trilogy apart from just the story itself and the evolution, or not so evolution, of the characters. Because El Mariachi as a character does kind of like, he has the arc from being the random nobody in El Mariachi to the revenge-obsessed killing machine in Desperado, and then he's still the revenge-obsessed killing machine in Once Upon a Time in Mexico, just for a different reason, for a different woman. Well, woman and child now, so I guess that's kind of a bit more of an evolution, but still. But seeing it evolve as far as filmmaking goes, and bringing in new characters also, made the whole trilogy evolve in this really interesting way. So, yeah, as far as if I have, like, a favorite of the trilogy, I kind of, every time I watch this one, I almost feel like saying it, but I feel like I just have this too much of a soft spot for Desperado, and it's like the way that I saw Desperado so early when I was discovering movies in general, I think just kind of sticks with me. And that's not to dismiss how great El Mariachi is by itself, and like we were talking about, it's easy to dismiss El Mariachi because you can just praise it for, oh, it was only made for $7,000, but it's actually genuinely, like, if it was the same movie with a higher budget, it would be just as good. So this is a whole quite of an accomplishment here, which is great. But that would be the way I see the trilogy in itself. So I think that's going to be it for this. So we're going on to another franchise, which should be fun and interesting. I guess I can go ahead and tell you. One at a time, we're going to go into the Tremors franchise. It was going to be one video, like when I did the Saws last year, but I'm already doing, we're going to do a trilogy and a quadrilogy, both at the end of October. So for the sake of, bunching things together, I figure we'll stretch the Tremors out the way we did this, one at a time. So that'll be one of the next things we do. We still have more verses and more new releases and a couple of other individual things as well. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.